Hey everybody, welcome to the GenChurch Midweek Podcast, a podcast about everyday people who are committed to expanding God's family because of Jesus for generations to come. My name is Jon, I'm the engagement pastor, and sitting next to me is Kyle Davies, the lead pastor.
Yeah, we're ready to go, man. Yeah, I like this.
I know, I'm back. I got my Black Rock going on here. It's fall, so I'm going back to my Americanos, moving away from the cold drinks.
Shameless plug. Heck
yeah, man. They're right down the road. I love that place. Good one to go to. We also had taste testing this weekend.
Yes, we did.
Generations Coffee hopes for the future.
Yes, shout out Kids and Cobras.
Yeah.
Go check them out.
Yeah, it was pretty good, man. I'm excited for what it's going to be for us. I know a lot of people were raving about it this weekend. It's
good.
Cool having it. So
good.
Yeah, shout out to Sam and them for that.
Yes, putting together some good coffee. You can join all of their different coffee programs. I don't even know what they are, but I'm just saying we are part of one of their coffee clubs, and we absolutely love, and I'm hesitant to use that word sometimes because we're actually going to talk about that word love here a little bit and how it relates to Mark, but it's like their coffee is like good. It is very, very good, tasty, enjoyable, all kinds of different blends and roasts. So go check them out.
Of course. And talking about that, Kyle, you kind of mentioned like we're going through a series through Mark. Mm-hmm. We kicked that off this weekend.
Yes, we did.
Hit the first part of Mark, man. How crazy to think that we're actually at this series now and going through it. Time flies, man.
It is.
It really
It is.
Oh
yes.
gosh. But as we were going through this weekend, I think one thing kind of stood out to me and I noticed is it felt like this passage had a lot of Old Testament quotations, or at least you referenced quite a few this weekend. You kind of threw a lot out and said, hey, have fun with this week, or even scroll on your phone, go find it while I'm talking as well. But Kyle, like you mentioned a lot of these. So what is, like for you, what was the connection and parallel to this passage? Like why bring these up, and how do they change our understanding and fullness of going through this first part of Mark?
Yeah, the reason that I asked people and to go look these passages up, and I mentioned them, some in passing and one kind of at the beginning, I dwelt on a little bit more to mention, hey, this is a combination of two other passages, but why does the author, mention, just it's from Isaiah? And it's actually for that reason. My goal is to help people learn how to read the Bible and read the Bible well. And sometimes what people will do is they'll point out right here at the beginning of Mark and say, listen, it says from Isaiah the prophet, but yet these passages don't both come from Isaiah. This quotation doesn't. So is the Bible error? Is it wrong? And I don't necessarily want to go down that rabbit hole today, but what the goal is to simply provide a simple explanation to say Isaiah was the most famous prophet, and he made up the bulk of the quotation. So the writer, Mark, wasn't necessarily concerned about attributing the whole passage to the right people. What he's just saying is this was a prophecy. Together they were prophecies about the messenger that would come before God himself appeared, and then he introduces us to Jesus. And so really it's to help us understand that the biblical authors were concerned sometimes about things that we aren't concerned about, and that sometimes we get concerned about things that they aren't concerned about. They were ultimately concerned about the thematic elements, and that's what Mark is really emphasizing here at the start, is to say, I'm going to pull these themes throughout the foundational Hebrew Old Testament scriptures to help lay a foundation to set the scene for you to be introduced to Jesus. And so he's pulling these thematic elements together to set the scene for Jesus. So why I mentioned that in passing was to help us be able to access our Bibles well and provide a little bit of that understanding without getting too deep in the weeds, which that's exactly what this podcast is for, is to get a little bit more deep into the weeds.
Maybe we'll have to dive into textual interpretation from Hebrew to Greek to our manuscripts. Some people might think it's a snooze fest. I personally love it. I even have a book on my shelf that I'm reading by Joshua Berman, and he kind of walks through even some of the what people would point out as inconsistencies.
Yes.
And kind of talking through the different, and his whole first chapter is talking about something earlier in the Old Testament, but it's even what you were talking about is the writing styles were so different.
Yes.
Because back then, they're doing more of a thematic. They want to communicate a point or even a theme to their people through the way in which they told a story. And nowadays, it's so different because we have Google. And it's a Google check. Oh, I need to make sure you tell this 100% correctly as it is. And it's been a very different change of critiquing and style of writing. And so I even think that's an interesting point you make, and something, a whole nother rabbit hole we can go down another time.
Well, you heard me, hopefully, in the teaching, mention that what Mark is building to is a point in Mark chapter 8, and then he'll again build to a second point of conclusion in Mark chapter 15. And so pulling out those passages, and Mark doesn't do it a lot because he knows his audience isn't entirely familiar with the Old Testament. So the goal isn't to put a whole bunch of Jewish customs and traditions in front of you and try to understand that culture. He just needed to lay a good foundation to show as people respond, as they listen to Jesus, both positively and negatively, and some people just kind of throw their hands in the air and go, we don't know what to do with this, Jesus, that there's at least a foundation for why some of those people will react in different ways. And so we needed to understand that even as God introduces us to Jesus through the voice through heaven, that it's consistent with what he has said before. And I think that is hugely important to understand the character and the consistency of God, is to say that he is going to say what he has said before to us, which helps us trust what he says to us in terms of even our own identity.
So let me ask you a question. You mentioned that there's different themes in which we're going to see in Mark. Kyle, what as we're kind of going through this first part in which you're talking about, what theme do you see developing and that's going to carry us for the first part of this series?
So the first part, we're going to learn who Jesus is and who Jesus is in terms of being the Messiah, being the Christ. That's what this first part is going to build to. And so you're going to see Jesus be put in a lot of positions where people will attribute this messianic, this Christ figure. And again, some will understand, some won't understand, and some will just kind of go, yeah, we'll kind of figure it out later, and just kind of exist around. So some of those themes will come out that way. But as we're introduced to Jesus, that first theme that we're introduced to is identity. And that's where I say who Jesus is, because when we understand Jesus's identity, we'll understand what he has done for us, and then we can understand our identity and then properly respond to him and live in response to who God says that we are.
Yeah, I like how you go into that. You make that connection of when we understand who Jesus is rightly, we're able to understand who we are. Because, we've talked about this a lot, in how we are made in the image of God, how we are to reflect and be and follow the example in which Jesus said, we are to be shaped by the Holy Spirit into who he is to be. And so I know you were sharing a couple of content things throughout the week that even hit on this concept of helping us understand in a culture that is full of guilt, shame, and just anxiety, because there's if we're honest, we are imperfect. Yeah. And when you look at Jesus, it's tough to go, I see Jesus, but how do I begin to see myself in a similar light? Because Jesus is perfect and I am not. I fall so short. And we are in a midst of a culture that is so much shame and feel guilty for what you've done. And even when we talk about being canceled or being an outsider because of that, this begins to really shape us. When I loved how Peggy said it in our Facebook group this week. We've asked her to do kind of walk us through a series where each week she's going to be doing something on Wednesdays where it's helping us understand who the Trinity of God is and how that relationship we have with them. And the first week of what she said was, remind yourself that I am loved and I belong. Yeah. That even when we recognize I'm imperfect, I mess up, I sin, I fall into temptation, which we talked about, is that we still have the identity that we are adopted into the family. That because of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, the ministry in which he had here, God came to us to make a way for us to not be seen by our sin, by the guilt and shame in which we might have, but by who Jesus truly is. And I love how you began to frame that this week.
It's trying to figure out what our identity is. And so often in our culture, and Jon, you might be able to speak to this a little bit, is sometimes we define our identity or we describe who we are by what we are not. And sometimes that's helpful, but I find in our culture today that, it used to be said maybe even about the church, how, we're known more for what we're against than what we're for. But I see that out in our culture as a whole is when we're described about what we are and who we are and what we're for, it's well, we're against this or we're anti this, therefore that makes us who we are. But identity is a little bit of a fickle thing. So is there something in culture, or is there something that you see that might help us get a better grasp on identity and even how that relates to this passage?
I think one thing that stands out to me, and I'm not sure if this is exactly where you're going, so you can kind of steer me back.
Yeah.
But I think one thing that pops in my mind when I think of identity, and it's kind of a weird thing, mostly because I'm kind of reusing mine right now, is how we use a resume.
Okay.
In the sense of like on a resume, like you are talking about yourself. You're saying, this is who I am. This is what I'm qualified at. This is what I'm good and the skills and talents in which I have. This is how you, like, honestly, like a resume and a cover letter, like you're selling yourself to somebody because you're saying, hey, like this is who I am. And I think one thing that I've noticed so much when people build resumes or they do interviews, and I've talked with a couple of my buddies who are still in college and kind of helping them with some of theirs, is, man, people are shy to have confidence in who they are. People are feel like it's not good to say like this is who I am or talk about, and like even like there's a little bit of like you brag on yourself a bit, like and that's okay to do that.
And you're saying that they're uncomfortable a little bit.
I think it's just this part of like you don't want to push yourself on others. You don't like, mostly because people begin to focus, like you said, our culture focuses on the negativity, on where we fall short, what we're not good at, what our weakness is. Like you see people that find it easier to point out these are my weaknesses rather than this is my strength.
Where do you think that comes from?
Man, I really think it comes back around to what we talk about of the shame and guilt and just constant of how we look at our society. Okay, I'll give you an example.
Okay.
Look at the LeBron James debate right now. Literally, the first thing I feel like the first thing in which I always see is the comparison between him and Michael Jordan, and everyone's like, well, these are his weaknesses where he wasn't as good.
Yes.
Instead of just saying like, hey, LeBron James is a phenomenal player.
Yes, he is.
Who has done this. Instead of just, hey, the first thing we're going to say is LeBron James is great. Here's his accomplishments and what he's done. And rather it turns into a debate where we're going to point out, ooh, maybe he didn't have the best appearance in this finals game. Or this isn't his best stat or his ability. They're going to go and point out the turnovers he had in game 3. They're going to go point out that and not the fact that, okay, like he just set so many records, moved up to second in assists and second in all these things. Like it's such a movement of our culture to tear down, to belittle, to, because we, like, for us, like that's what happens to us. So we just innately do that with others.
So what I hear in that is there's credentials, there's standards, and when you put those out there, what you're actually doing is you're opening yourself up for critique and evaluation. That when you put yourself out there and you're trying to be measured by a set of external standards or criteria, what that actually does is, because you've identified yourself with those standards and criteria, when you put yourself out there and then they are critiqued, actually it actually attacks the sense of who you are and your self-worth. And what's so difficult is our identity is so interlinked for us by our actions, by our credentials, by a set of standards. And what provides the freedom is when we realize who we are is not tied to those criteria, those set of standards. It's actually defined by not what we've done, but something that God has done, something that who he says we are. And that's the reverse way of thinking. But we're so accustomed, if I hear you saying this, that's how we evaluate everything, that we're very hesitant to just simply say, LeBron and who he is, when he entered the league with all the pressure and all the standards, he has overcome a lot. Yeah. He is a great person in the sense that when you look at his impact and care for other people, whether his school, his foundation, and again, even there's verging on of saying, look at the standards, look at the criteria. When you just look at the who he is as a person, we're trying to evaluate everything by a set of standards rather than a level of character that's found, again, innately and internally, simply because he's another human being. And so
well, because what it does is it builds limitations in the sense of like we build up these worldly limitations of like, hey, you have to cross this threshold, you have to cross this barrier until you're a good person or you're successful or you're great in this. Like there are standards and barriers in which we set up, and I know we talked about this a long time ago, and it might just be a refresher of what we see in Jesus is that those barriers and those thresholds and limitations are torn down, and it says like, you are brought into my family. That is your identity, and you don't have to feel shame or guilt because maybe you might fall short in one area, but Jesus is great and strong and mighty, and so even our weaknesses, God is still strong.
Yeah, well, and it's tough to reconcile the two when our whole world evaluates who we are with a different standard, which I think ultimately it crushes us. And so if what's difficult, and both for someone who is not a follower of Jesus and someone who is a follower of Jesus, is to recognize that their identity, again, is not self-given, nor is it self-achieved, but it's actually given wholly independently of the action. And then it's to help our experiences and our action catch up to that. Because when we live in reverse, we can never do enough, we can never be enough. And then when we internalize that, we will feel that fear, guilt, shame. And then we won't want to put ourselves out there because we're fearful that someone will say something that strikes us to the very core of our being. And so if you are someone who is feeling crushed or feeling the weight of trying to live up to some set of external standards, or trying to actualize a self-imposed identity, you're going to feel the weight of that because you're never going to be, you're never going to live up to even your own standard that you put, because you might look at someone else and compare yourself to someone else and go, well, I'm not quite like them. And it's that internal back and forth. So whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, I would challenge us to return to the core in the biblical framework, which is we are not what we have done, but we are simply living in response to what God has done and who he says we are. And Jesus experiences that at his baptism. He hears that voice. And I think we all internally long for that voice. And we misplace our affections and our desires and our drive into other things within the world to try to hear that voice, whether from ourselves or from others, or even from some. We even try to live up to our own standards with God. It's we crave that approval, that achievement, and it's like we just long for someone else to say, or even that self-validation of ourselves to say, okay, finally I am good enough. And the challenge here is not to go, cool, I am finally good enough. The challenge is, and really, it's to say, no, actually, like, I'm not good enough. I won't be good enough, but God says I'm good enough. And so let me live as if that is true. So, John, let me ask you this. What are some ways that might prove or demonstrate that we're living in such a way that God says, you are my loved child. I am pleased with you. What might be some things that we see in our life that is the response of living as if that is true from God?
Yeah. I think I got two things that come to mind. I think the first one is that we have to be willing to humble ourselves in the sense of, hey, it's okay to be wrong. We are all wrong at some point. Laugh about that. We look at the world, and it's always I defend something, and it's like, ooh, you think about it in your head, and after a while you go, oh, I might be wrong in this, but I'm going to keep going with this point.
You're unwilling to change your mind.
I'm unwilling to change my mind because I want to be good enough. I want to be right. I want to show that I know what I'm talking about. And it's to say like, hey, like it's okay to be wrong every now and then because we are all growing together. And and that's the thing is like, hey, if as you are growing with Jesus, none of your thoughts, your theology, your philosophy, the way you live your life, if none of that is changing and you're saying, oh yeah, everything that Jesus says matches up perfectly with my life, like I would encourage you, like be willing to say, God, like where am I inconsistent? Where do I need to grow? And to humble myself and say, God, I'm not perfect. I don't want to lie to myself and tell myself that I am. I know that there are places that I need to grow, and that is okay. And that's where it comes around to the second part is as we look at other people, we have to be willing to be forgiving and accepting even in other people's faults. And so I think that comes back around to like when we encourage people to come to church and everything, we encourage people to get baptized and grow in their faith and everything, to tell them like, hey, you don't have to be perfect when you first walk in the doors. You don't have to be perfect when you show up to a community group. You don't have to be perfect when you get baptized. What? I know, right? But no, it's literally to say like, we are all imperfect. We are all growing. I am willing to say that I need to grow. And so that's going to change how I see other people's. And I want to be able to give them the opportunity to grow and not have this unmet expectation of them when they first walk in. And so it's to tell people like, no, like you are loved and you belong no matter who you are, what you've done, what you haven't done, where you've been. Like when you walk in the doors, when you walk into a community of people, you belong and you are loved because your identity is not found in the worldly things of how people look at you, but rather it's found in how God looks at you and the identity he has set for you.
And then what happens is we begin to change. That's the beautiful thing, is the goal is not change before, but it's actually when we recognize that we are lovely, when we are worth it, when we are strong, when we are who God says we are, and we recognize that because God is who he says he is, then we will experience change, not just in changing mind by being able to be humble and to change our mind, but we will actually be able to experience restoration in relationships. We will be able to experience peace in circumstances where before we would have been anxious or we would have been scared to put ourselves out there. But at the end of the day, when we go and we live from a place that has already been filled up, we will stop trying to fill up our lives with words, with actions, with attaboys, attagirls from others. And instead we will live from a place of abundance and acceptance rather than a place of trying to earn the abundance or the acceptance. And so whether you're a Christian or non-Christian today, we really hope that we will be able to go on this journey with you to explore what it looks like to follow Jesus, what it looks like to be a part of God's family. And we hope that you continue to journey with us through the book of Mark so that we can listen and respond together.
Thanks for joining us on this week's Midweek Podcast. We want to help make your faith an everyday faith, whether you're brand new to this or whether you've been journeying with us for a while. So be sure to send us a message. Drop a question if you're like, hey, I need you to talk about this next week because you said something and I was like, what in the world does that even mean? Like, let us know. Also, be checking out our social media, our website. We're dropping out different devotionals, different blogs, different videos to begin to help you as we go through Mark. Like, it's more than just Sunday, but it's an everyday experience where we're growing and being shaped by Jesus as we grow and seek out the Holy Spirit who's alive and working with us. So thanks for joining us this week. Hope you will join us next week.